Namaskar. Well friends, I heartily welcome all of you to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. This podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Ambedkar, on his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the great grand vision that he had shown for the future of our great country. This is what this podcast series is all about. If you like this podcast series, please like it, share it, and subscribe it. So let's proceed. Well friends, in the next 5 episodes, we are going to cover a core dimension of Dr. Ambedkar's multifaceted genius, his contribution as an economist extraordinaire. And in my view, as an economist, the greatest economist that India has given to the world. The focus of this episode 3 is on Dr. Ambedkar's first thesis on economics that he wrote at the age of only 24. It is not really a big dissertation. Actually, it is 42 pages research paper. This scholarly research paper was titled Administration and Finance of the East India Company. It was submitted by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar for MA degree at the Columbia University, United States. This thesis essentially presents a historical review of changes in administration and finance of the East India Company during the period 1792 to 1858. Dr. Ambedkar clearly demonstrates how those changes invariably led to the suffering of the Indian people at the hands of the British rulers. The East India Company got a foothold in India in the name of trading, as we all know, but then over a period of time gradually extended its rule over almost the entire country. Initially, the East India Company had the monopoly of Indian trade, and for allowing that privilege to the East India Company, the British government, as neatly explained by Dr. Ambedkar, quote unquote, were determined to derive as large a gain as possible, unquote. This went on till the year 1833. By the British Parliament's Act of 1834, the East India Company's monopoly power was withdrawn and the Indian trade was thrown open to the British public. While the East India Company ceased to be a commercial corporation, it continued as a political sovereign of territories under its control. The East India Company, in fact, established by law what was then called the company government. Later, the company government itself was abolished by the British government in the year 1858 by the British Parliament's Act, designated as an Act for Better Governance of India. Please note that this act was enacted in the year 1858. That was immediately after the first war for independence that was fought in 1857. Dr. Ambedkar presented a perceptive analysis of the finances of the East India Company and demonstrated how injustice was inflicted by the British upon the Indian people. First, the profits of the East India Company were not retained in India. They were transferred by the East India Company to the shareholders in UK as dividends. Second, when the flow of dividends was not enough, huge debt was raised by the East India Company in India. And there were two distinctly different ways of raising debt by the company government. By the way, company government borrowed money from people. First was the Indian debt. The Indian debt was raised within India, whereas the home bond debt was raised in England by issuing bonds. Now just look at the numbers given by Dr. Ambedkar. During the period 1792 to 1857, while the Indian debt rose by a whopping 767% to reaching a level of 61 million pounds, on the other hand, the home bond debt was confined to merely to less than 7 million pounds. Why so? Because the capacity of the East India Company to borrow in England was strictly regulated by the British Parliament. Why was the British Parliament controlling the borrowings by the East India Company? This was cleverly done to protect the British capital in case the East India Company loses its hold in India. So, when East India Company was forced in 1834 to discontinue its commercial operations, it was allowed to continue its existence as a political sovereign of its territories in India. That is when the so-called company government, company sarkar came into existence. When that happened, the entire load of East India Company debt, this is what Dr. Ambedkar points out in his short essay, that the huge debt that the East India Company had accumulated, 68 million pounds, which was a huge one, all of that was put on the shoulders of the Indian natives who had little or nothing to do whatsoever with the East India Company operations. And then there were other grievances Dr. Ambedkar has explained. For example, there was imposition of prohibitive duties on the Indian manufactures exported to England, but negligible duties on the British manufacturers imported in India. The reason is very simple. They wanted to discourage the Indian manufacturing. So whatever was manufactured in India and exported to England, they imposed heavy duties to discourage the Indian exporters. And on the British manufacturing, they lowered the duties on the British manufacturers so that they could be readily imported in India and they would find huge market in India for the manufacturers in Great Britain. Then there was exemption of duty on the cotton exports from India, basically to help the British mill owners and manufacturers. 4. Dr. Ambedkar has given a detailed statement, a statistical account showing that during the period 1792 to 1885-86, on an average, just imagine, 54% of the tax, total revenue, was collected from the land tax. And what was the rate of taxation on the land? Range between 80 to 90% of the rental. In contrast to, just to see how large this is, 80 to 90% of the rental was the tax in India, whereas in England, for 100 years before that period, the taxation on land was between 5 to 20%. So just compare 5 to 20% tax on land in England and 80 to 90% tax on land in India. Basically, this was nothing but exploitation of Indian people. Actually, Dr. Ambedkar points out that while the British government was doing nothing different from the earlier Mughal governments, he says that, and I quote Dr. Ambedkar, what Mohammedan rulers claimed they could never fully realize, but what the British rules claimed they realized with vigor, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar also presented an insightful analysis of company government's expenditure as well. He observed, this is a very important observation, he observed that 45 to 64% of the total expenditure by the company government that was towards military charges. So military expenditure out of the total expenditure was as high as it ranged between 45% to 64%. In contrast, what was the developmental expenditure by the British in India? The developmental expenditure like public works, like roads, canals, bridges, electricity, telegraphs, expenditure on that was negligibly small. For example, and this is an eye-opening example that Bhimrao Ambedkar gives, that during the period 1834 to 1848, one city of Manchester, the amount of money spent on water alone, that was larger than all kinds of development expenditures which were made in a continental country like India. So just compare and contrast. One city expenditure on water alone in Manchester, the expenditure by the government was more than all the developmental expenditure in entire continental country like India. This is an eye-opening kind of observation that Dr. Ambedkar has made. Dr. Ambedkar pointed out that, and I quote, the public debt of India, at least under company's rule, was entirely the creation of war, unquote. Quoting another researcher, Dr. Ambedkar pointed out that, and I quote, while the British had spent so much on their other colonial possessions and waged so many costly wars for foreigners, they had laid no money on the acquisition or improvement of their Indian empire. On the other hand, as a matter of fact, India had regularly paid to Great Britain a heavy tribute in the form of home charges, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar also closely examined the so-called Act for Better Governance of India of 1858. The Act was upheld by many contemporary scholars, big names at that time, for the provision which was there that the revenues of India would not be spent outside India for non-Indian purposes without the consent of both houses of British Parliament. Indian scholars had gone gaga over this provision, that this is a salutary provision and all that. Dr. Ambedkar, with his characteristic sharpness, showed the futility of this provision because, as he called, there was a fatal error involved. And what was the fatal error? They had conveniently omitted the word previous before the consent. So previous consent of both houses of Parliament was not required. And since the previous consent of the Parliament was not necessary, the provision could not have the salutary impact that the Indian scholars were going gaga about. Please note that Dr. Ambedkar was only 24 years old when he wrote this thesis. As expected, therefore, Bhimrao Ambedkar's style is somewhat temperate and he resorts to quoting other contemporary scholars. But his thesis did demonstrate the great potential that Bhimrao had. Finally, evaluating the contributions of England to India, Dr. Ambedkar concluded, and I quote, the immenseness of India's contribution to England is as much astounding as nothingness of the England's contribution to India. Building modern institutions including administrative and judicial systems. He maintained, however, whether, and I quote him again, whether mere animal peace is to be preferred to economic destitution is something that is left to be decided for oneself. Dr. Ambedkar developed this brief thesis into a full-fledged dissertation for his PhD degree later. While doing that, Bhimrao Ambedkar eschewed his temperate style and adopted a bold and aggressive style which became the hallmark of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Well, friends, let's conclude this session here. When we meet next in episode 4, I will be talking about Dr. Ambedkar's PhD dissertation and its relevance in today's day and time. Friends, if you like this podcast series, please like it, share it, and subscribe it. Thank you, dhanyavad, and so long until we meet again. Namaskar.